This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Anatolian Dispatch. Today we have Ambassador Mark D. Wallace, who is now an American businessman, a former diplomat, and a lawyer. He has served in a variety of government positions for the United States. He was ambassador to the United Nations as the U.S. representative to the Committee on Management and Reform. He is now currently the CEO of United Against Nuclear Iran and also the CEO of the Counter Extremism Project. He is also launching the Turkish Democracy Project. I believe it was about a month ago that it launched. And one thing I wanted to mention in his resume, which is extensive, this is just a short bit, that the United Against Nuclear Iran program has been very successful in getting private sanctions. Where there's a lot of focus in the news about using government sanctions against, let's just call it a misbehaving regime. But people forget that the private sector is the major driver in Western economies and increasingly in what I would call all the free economies around the world, the ones that are not under the thumb of their government leaders. And that is a powerful tool to be used in, let's just say, inducing better behavior from different regimes around the world. So with that, I want to say welcome, Ambassador Wallace, and thank you for joining us today.
Ed, thank you for having me. It's a real privilege for me to be on your podcast, and I look forward to talking to you about the Turkish Democracy Project as well as the foreign policy challenge that I think is Turkey now. Thank you for having me on.
Okay. So you did launch about a month ago. So if the first order of business, I think, would be for you to just kind of give us an overview of how the Turkish Democracy Project got launched and what your purpose and key goals are at this point.
Sure. As a former diplomat, you know this, but historically, the great foreign policy challenges of our time and the times before us have usually been met by governments, foreign ministries, sometimes defense departments and intelligence services grappling with these major foreign policy challenges. But historically, as you mentioned, the private sector or the NGO world has played an important role. Going back to the Anti-Apartheid movement, Soviet Jewry, the Save Darfur movement, you've seen a variety of private movements that have worked alongside governments to impress positive foreign policy change in a manner that hopefully was always reasonable and thoughtful and accomplished its goals. Sometimes they met with great success. Sometimes they've met with mixed success. And really, in our mind, in my expertise, is really that of economic pressure. We call it economic war. Other people call it economic war. It's probably a harsh term because there should be no illusion that the asymmetrical types of warfare, meaning economic, is at all remotely comparable to the brave men and women that fight real wars. But that's generally the term and lexicon that's used. Also, the cyber warfare side of it. Again, that's probably too strong a word, but that's the lexicon of the business, where people try to fight for the space that is cyberspace so that the propaganda that emanates from these very difficult regimes is checked by truth and facts, or where there is other malicious behavior going on online, we stop that. So really, my background is engaging in economic and cyber warfare, fighting for space on the internet, going back with the Iranians many, many years, extremist groups from the Counter Extremism Project and the like. And as somebody that was formerly stationed in Ankara, you know that the challenge of Turkey has gotten progressively and more progressively difficult as President Erdogan has become more and more ensconced in power, and the corruption, the malicious behavior, the malign behavior coming out of the Erdogan regime grows and grows. And I think that amongst foreign policy watchers, probably not in the general public yet, or even in general foreign policy circles, the challenge of Turkey is one that is upon us. And we took it upon ourselves, along with a lot of very bright, talented formers that are across the political spectrum. I think it's important to recognize that, to say, what can we do to hopefully convince the Erdogan government to fundamentally change for the benefit, first and foremost, of the Turkish people, and then secondarily, but very importantly, for all of its allies in the region around the world, like the United States. And using the tactics and tools from using economic pressure tools, research tools, and the truth and transparency of legitimate online counter-programming against propaganda. What could we do to help drive Turkey to return to its more secular, liberal, if you will, roots, and avert the direction that Turkey appears to grow, which is really incredibly difficult for the Turkish people and for its allies around the world. So the Turkish Democracy Project was launched, and of course, right when it was launched, we were met with a cyber attack that we attribute to cronies of President Erdogan and the Grey Wolves, which are his extremist sort of cronies that go around threatening and killing, threatening people and intimidating people. We had personal and death threats made to some of our Turkish members, and we had a variety of other mischief. We received the attention of a lot of news services that were aligned with the Erdogan government and the AKP, all decrying our work, which is ironic because I'd like to tell you we've done a lot of work, Ed, but we really put up a website telling people what we were going to do. We haven't even started, so I can only imagine when we really get started focusing on the really problematic business risks associated with Erdogan's Turkey, Erdogan himself, his cronies, his corrupt oligarchs, and the AKP party. When we start highlighting those business risks to Western American and Western and even Asian businesses, we think that the Turkish economy, which is growing more and more isolated, will increasingly become even more isolated. And I think that President Erdogan will ultimately face a choice between a prosperous economy, and there's no reason that the Turkish economy shouldn't prosper, given the greatness of its people, its wonderful economy, a potential economy. But President Erdogan has driven that economy into isolation, and we think that we can impress upon him that at some point he will have to choose between a thriving economy and his ability to thrive as the de facto dictator of Turkey. With the elections coming up in a couple of years, hopefully the people of Turkey will have a chance to vote him legitimately out of office and return Turkey to its secular roots. And we want to be able to be a voice, a thoughtful voice of those Turks that can't speak for themselves, and to impress upon Turkey its growing isolation as caused by its foreign policy positions, by really a malign government, and that it can continue to thrive by returning to its secular and liberal roots that were associated with freedom, with human rights, dignity, and alliances with like-minded countries. If Erdogan was willing to change, I promise you, I will be the first one to celebrate that. I'm a little pessimistic about that, given that we were received quite with a hostile reaction. But hope springs eternal. We've seen this before, Ed, where some very malign leaders in the past have seen the light of day and have changed their behavior and been received differently in the international community. That's always possible. I hope that's the case with President Erdogan. If not, we hope that he and his corrupt oligarchs and the AKP party are voted out of office to never be seen again. That's sort of the mission of the Turkish Democracy Project. We have become expert in some of these tools and tactics of private foreign policy, sanctions, and cyber work. And we hope to apply them in the right, thoughtful manner to President Erdogan, his corrupt oligarchs, and the AKP party. And I keep saying that, and you'll probably hear that as a narrative a little bit, because this isn't about the Turkish people. This is about the man that has turned Turkey in this direction, the men, and I do mean men, that have profited and used the money to use power to control that economy, and his associated party that he uses as the beard of democracy to impress and to suppress dissent in Turkey. So it really is President Erdogan, those corrupt oligarchs around him, and the AKP party that will be our focus. I hope that provides an overview, and I'm happy to answer all the questions that you have about it the best I can.
It is. I think it's a great overview. You touched on a number of really important kind of subtopics within that. Let me hit on one. I mean, you emphasized several times, and right there at the end, on this is not about the Turkish people. This is not directed against the Turkish people. This is not about punishing them for the leadership that they now have. This is about, in a sense, I don't want to use this word because it now has a negative connotation in the Middle East about, you know, Westerners coming in to liberate other people, and the aftermath that sometimes is obviously not what anybody had hoped would occur from those moments of liberation. But in fact, what you're really talking about is getting the Turkish people, getting them more freedom in the terms of, you know, the press being, you know, no longer controlled by the state, because for all intents and purposes now in Turkey, the press really is under the control of the state. There's very few independent voices. There used to be many more. And also the really strong kind of development that's happened, very negative development that's happened with any criticism of the government, which in the past would have been ignored or, you know, just blithely forgotten about. Even the most minor of criticisms results in a very heavy-handed response by the government, which actually you experienced. I mean, quite frankly, you know, you launched, and no one really, you know, had any notion. Nobody in Turkey really understood what you were doing, but the government seems to have reacted quite strongly against, you know, the coupling of the words democracy and Turkish. It really was kind of, you know, well, I want to say shocking, but it wasn't shocking because too many of us have seen it before. You had a reaction that many other people, particularly in Turkey, have experienced, that even the slightest implication of a criticism of the Erdogan AKP government brings a very heavy-handed response from that government. And how are you going to thread the needle? Because the needle is communicating to the Turkish people that you're not their enemy, that you don't want to see them punished, that in fact you want to see them have greater liberty, greater freedom, greater both economic, social, and civil freedom. Yet, as long as President Erdogan and the AKP are in power, unless they make a radical change, they're in the way of all those freedoms happening.
It's a very good question. And look, it's not funny, it's sad. I've been around, and as a former diplomat, and so have you have, I've been around these diasporas movements for a long time. I've been around the Iranian diaspora, around the Turkish diaspora, other diasporas. And it is very difficult for diaspora, either, for example, the Iranian people or the Iranian diaspora or the Turkish people or the Turkish diaspora, to speak up against their leaders. Because what happens is they're threatened, they're jailed, they can be killed, they can be beaten. As Americans, I don't have Turkish blood in me, we can speak up in ways that these diasporas cannot. So I remember when we were starting, you know, one of the questions always is asked is, well, all the Turks that are involved or all the Iranians that are involved, I can tell you in the context of Iran, it's very difficult for the Iranian diaspora to speak up against the Iranian government. Just yesterday, Masih Alinejad, who's a vocal opponent of the Iranian regime, it was revealed that there was an Iranian intelligence cell that was going to kidnap her, render her to Iran, and jail her. We had some wonderful Turkish academics on our board, and the first thing that happened is when we launched, they were immediately threatened with death, killing, their friends threatened. We had a person jailed in Turkey, not one of our people, but somebody that was a contact, one of our people. You know, and the non-Turk Americans that are on our board, we don't feel that vulnerability. There's some very prominent, wonderful people on our board, and we don't feel that vulnerability because these brutal dictators, brutal leaders, they go after their own people. So when I think in many ways our launch ratified the purpose of our existence. We're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't, if we have Turks involved in our project, because the Turks will be threatened, intimidated, and otherwise.
Right.
But if we don't have them, well, we will be criticized for not having Turks. Look, the only way you can prove the negative here is by consistently and thoughtfully doing this work and standing up for the rights of people that cannot speak openly against their government. And that's what we're going to do with the Turkish Democracy Project. I've been in this business a long time. And suffice to say, Ed, that I don't have an agenda other than for this project to be correctly and hopefully wisely impress its mission and succeed in its mission for the benefit of the Turkish people. I'm willing to admit here today, Ed, this is a big announcement, that I am not seeking to be the mayor of Istanbul anytime soon. I am not looking to go back to go to Turkey and be an elected official or somehow, feather my own nest inside of Turkey. This is what we believe in. You have a bunch of people that believe in this, and we're hoping that we can stand up and speak for people that can't speak for themselves. And that's what motivates our cause. And when Turks are intimidated, those of us that don't have direct contacts with Turkey, we can continue to speak out, and we will do that. And we'll do that tirelessly. And we will not allow President Erdogan, what I view as his thugs, let me make that clear. He has a thugocratic-like mentality and regime to intimidate our NGO that works with our government and governments around the world. We will not allow him to intimidate us, and we will do our best to protect the Turkish people that are involved in our project. But to suffice to say, what agenda could we have? I'm not looking to be president of Turkey. We're here to do this first and foremost for the great Turkish people. I know we both have many Turkish friends and think the world of the Turkish people. And we will continue to do that as long as we have breath in our lungs. We're going to continue to advocate for the Turkish people and try to return Turkey to a path of prosperity, human rights, human dignity, and strong alliances with our Western democracies, because that's important not only for the Turks, but for all of us.
Well, I think that's an important role to play because, my experience, ratifies that. I mean, I have close friends who I would love to have come on this podcast who could talk about their personal experiences of Turkey, so they could get out to non-Turks what a wonderful country it is, what a great people it is, what it's just touring the country, just meeting people. The hospitality of the average Turk is just amazing. And that sort of thing oftentimes gets lost inside the Capital Beltway. You have people who focus on the dire situation within, for example, the NATO alliance that Erdogan has created by a number of his actions. And so they talk about, expelling Turkey from NATO or other ideas in the same line. I'm like, wait a second, stop focusing on, stop punishing the entire country or trying to punish the entire country for the misdeeds of one man and, his leadership team in the AKP. So I applaud
that's
that.
a wrong narrative. But think about how false that. We've seen this before, Ed. The reason why these thugocratic leaders like President Erdogan are successful is they brutalize their own people into silence, and then say when Turks aren't speaking up that if anybody tries to speak up for them, they say, well, there are no Turks joining you. That's the tactics of the thugocrat. And then when they say, you're trying to harm the Turkish people, we're not. President Erdogan and those corrupt oligarchs and his party have done better than most other regimes in the world in infiltrating that Erdogan neo-Ottomanism into the levers of economic power in Turkey. So that if you're doing significant business in Turkey, you have to do that business either directly or at least tacitly with Erdogan and his cronies. And that's why, I think we can stand up. But these are the up against them because we had the ability to impress the business risks in that country. But these are the tactics of a thugocrat. We've seen it before. And sadly, a brutal leader that is willing to harm his own people generally can stay in power longer if he's willing to harm, kill, and suppress his own people, unless outsiders that stand with his people stand up in opposition to him. And that's what we're going to do. We don't want there to be any silence. We want to be at least some voice against President Erdogan and his thugocrats.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would definitely say is, you noted that you really haven't started a lot of your work, and you already got this cyber attack. And trust me, many of us are very familiar with the trolls. That if they are not part of the presidency in Turkey, they are part of the AKP or some other affiliated group, and they are out there and they are active and they do harass and other people. The other thing, as people should know this, you mentioned South Africa, and obviously the situations are different in many ways, but there is something to be said for a comparison between Turkey at this point in history with its leadership and apartheid era South Africa. And you mentioned early on, it wasn't just diplomatic and political efforts by nation states against South Africa that brought an end to apartheid. It was also businesses realizing that they simply could not continue to do business as usual with a regime that denied basic civil and political rights to 3/4 of its population. That you couldn't do business with those people. And so you had to push them. The advantage in some ways was that many of the people in the South African white minority government came from the same value system as the people from the outside who were putting pressure on them to end apartheid.
I'll tell you, Ed, you're revealing both of our older age because you're going back to the apartheid example. But I actually think that you're very right. And I think that historically, it's underreported the impact of economic isolation, both in formal sanctions and the indirect private sector sanctions that refused to do business with the apartheid government, that had a huge effect in driving the end of apartheid. Look, it's a complicated story. I'm not saying it's exclusively that.
Sure.
But it certainly had a very, very significant effect. But think about it. It makes common sense. And the reason why a group like the Turkish Democracy Project or United Against Nuclear Iran can be more powerful now than it was at the time of apartheid is the tools of mass communications.
Right.
The type and the reason why the types of warfare are used as at least an allegory is that it used to be when you had a difficult foreign policy challenge, the tools in the tool shed were fairly limited. You had diplomacy, you had maybe some sanctions, and you had military intervention in some way, a military action. Now, in the modern era, you have social media, you have cyber, you have economic pressure that's both private and much more impactful than the era of just formal government sanctions. So the theaters of modern interaction or confrontation, I guess it's not politically correct to say that, where you can confront a malign actor, are greater than they were before because of the incredible tools of mass communications. I frequently say that, sometimes we'll get criticized. We get criticized by everyone. We get supported by everyone. It's not totally clear to me how it falls in the political range. It's more and more confused. But sometimes I hear on the left that we're too harsh on people. But if you think about it, it's quite a liberal, almost progressive effort to use pen and ink and ideas to replace bullets and bombs, right? We're trying to use the power of our purse, the power of our ideas, to impress foreign policy change in a manner that doesn't result in the loss of life or injury and to prevent suffering. Presumably, that's a narrative that many people could get behind. I'd like to think so. And ultimately, you know this because you're a diplomat. If you, ultimately, there's never been a bullet that can kill an idea, right?
Right.
And so we hope that we're going to win the battle of ideas. We hope that we're going to win the battle of economy, because no responsible business is going to do business with Erdogan's Turkey, with a central bank that's in shambles, with human rights repressed and reporters jailed, dissenters jailed, calling for a brutal action against Israel, for example. There are so many range of things that the Erdogan regime is doing right now that if you're a responsible business, you have to ask yourself, can we really do business there long term? And that's why the similarities, in many ways, again, I don't think the historical record reflects it as potently as it should. There are some historical parallels to the anti-apartheid movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key element here is, as you said, the tools available now for applying leverage against a malign regime are much greater than they were, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And, that's really important, and getting that word out is really important. I also think, when people start saying, oh, no, you can't use economic sanctions against a country because it harms the citizens, and they fail to understand that you can be more precise in how you use economic engagement now than you could years ago. I mean, just slapping on tariffs and broad sanctions, that is old. Even in the diplomatic realm, you don't do that. They're very targeted, or you try to make them targeted. So, for example, you would deny the visa to travel to the United States to certain members of the government to send a message, but you wouldn't stop the average tourist from a country visiting. And that's just a very small example. Within the private sector, you can do so much more without causing harm to the average citizen of a country. I think that's an important part of the message, because that helps to blunt the government's story, which is going to be that any of this economic leverage applied against them is actually targeting the Turkish citizens, when clearly it is not targeting the Turkish citizens. It's targeting the regime at the top.
It's a very good point. Look, targeted sanctions are more effective than general sanctions. But generally speaking, when you launch an effort like the Turkish Democracy Project or Iran previously, we find a Turkish economy already in shambles, right? The work of President Erdogan and his cronies, how many central bank governors have they had over the last?
I lost count.
Yeah, I mean, I've lost count too. What's the inflationary rate? The value of the Turkish lira. I mean, the economy is in shambles. And let's be very clear. The responsibility for that Turkish economy being in shambles lays squarely at the feet of President Erdogan. What we're saying is, let's use economic pressure and say to international businesses, you can't do business with President Erdogan, his cronies, or the AKP party. Now, let me tell you, they've infiltrated many of the economic levers of power inside of Turkey. We've already seen that. But I don't think any serious Turkish person thinks that as we try to specifically go after the gray wolves or corrupt oligarchs, that somehow that's targeting the Turkish people. So I find the argument made by Erdogan, his gray wolves, or the AKP, that somehow we're trying to hurt his economy. We're not trying to hurt his economy. We're trying to hurt him. We're trying to hurt the AKP. We're trying to hurt the corrupt oligarchs that are in power that have been so devastating to the Turkish people. I find the argument incredibly intellectually lazy. I hope at least when they try to debate us, they'd come up with something better than that. But I mean, the notion, look, I like to think that I can single-handedly fully cripple the Erdogan-controlled aspects of the Erdogan-controlled economy, I don't think I can. But let me tell you, the biggest ally that I have in showing the horrible deleterious effects on the Turkish economy is President Erdogan himself, the Grey Wolves, the oligarchs, the AKP, and others of his extremist thugs. I mean, they've done more to harm that economy than any of us could do combined.
Yeah,
right?
well, I mean, I think there's a broad consensus that building on reforms that that came before he entered really into power as prime minister and then as president, and that was about 20 years ago. That building on fundamental reforms to the economy that had been made by his predecessors, and all sorts of other things were happening simply in the world. The economy of Turkey was doing quite well for some time, but it started to go off the rails, I would say, just about 2013, and it has gotten progressively worse. And I think one of the key things, which you mentioned in your letter to him, is really the lack of any sort of independence for the central bank, and just the rampant corruption which has developed there, and also the lack of independence for the judiciary, which I think people don't understand how important it is to have a functioning economy which serves the largest number of people in the economy, to have an independent judiciary that can, without political influence or corrupt practices, rule on business disputes, on contracts. That without that independent judiciary, without that independent central bank, they're not just like chipping away at the structure, they're undermining the foundation of the economy, and that's the problem.
I mean, look, I think you really hit on something here. The Turkish nation, the Turkish people, when you look at the hallmarks of the potential of an economy, Turkey has always had enormous potential, a great workforce, natural resources, tourism, geographic location. This is an economy in this world, in this time, that should be thriving. And the responsibility for the failure of that economy clearly lays at, and it was a country that was on a path to continuing growth and success. The one common factor that derailed that ascent to even greater heights economically and really for the richness and power of the Turkish people was President Erdogan. And you mentioned the judiciary. Look, there are so many elements. We're watching a relatively slow motion descent into tyranny in Turkey. And because the world is challenged in so many places, they don't see what's happened from a monetary policy. The people around the world don't see first and foremost the repression, the suppression of speech, the brutal repression of dissent, the removal of an independent judiciary. All of these things see Turkey, which is so strategically important to all of us and to our Western democracies, but also to the Turkish people, this descent into a strongman, a thugocratic, a dictator-like figure. And, I was going to wait till the end of the show, but I really hope that all the Turks that want to speak out, that hear this, will contact me or you, because I know they can't necessarily speak for themselves. I know they can't necessarily come on your show, but I will listen and I will try to channel whatever it is that they have to say so that they can get their voice heard, because we know how brutal this guy is. If he was willing to do all those things you've seen reporters jailed, Ed, these people need to have their voices heard. And for those of us that don't have an agenda, that aren't Turkish, that don't have family in Turkey, we can speak up loudly, because he doesn't allow them to speak. He doesn't allow it. And we have to keep doing that. And when you don't have an independent judiciary, you don't have anywhere to turn if you try to speak up and your home is raided in the middle of the night by cronies of President Erdogan. You don't have anywhere to turn to. It's a very lonely feeling in a vast country when you're being persecuted by Erdogan and his cronies. There's no one that will come to your defense. We at least hope to be a voice on the international scene. I think we already are, standing up for those that can't speak for themselves.
Yeah. We are actually a little bit over our time allotment, but I hope we can pursue this again in the not too distant future once you get more going on. And I would add my voice that I will at the very end mention websites and addresses, or actually have you say them. But I did want to, before we close, I did want you to give me just a little reaction, because our listeners will be interested in this, about the appointment of former Senator Jeff Flake as the nominee to become the next ambassador to Turkey from the United States.
Senator Flake is a good man. He really is. And I think he understands these issues. Our team knows him very well. And I think he's going to be a great addition. I like the bipartisan nature of the appointment. And I think it shows the importance of the Turkish file right now, that the president appointed Senator Flake. And I hope and expect that he'll be confirmed expeditiously. And I expect that we'll be working closely with him. And I will just leave with one note. The one thing that we did after this is we've called for the sanctioning of the gray wolves in the United States of America. We've seen this happen in Europe. And I want all of your listeners to hear that already we are hoping to have the gray wolves sanctioned in the United States. And to anybody that claims somehow that hurts the Turkish people, I commend them to go talk to the families of the people that have been threatened.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Again, that was Ambassador Mark D. Wallace, who is the CEO of the Turkish Democracy Project. You can follow them at turkishdemocracy.com. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.